The next morning, Kevin woke everyone up with a loud greeting over their speakers. Everyone was still fast asleep since they had stayed up chatting long after Kevin and Charlie fell asleep. They made their way to Kevin's door, opened their locks, and found that the door would not open. Rita called through the door to Kevin to see if he had his key, and they could hear Kevin laughing. They looked at each other in confusion, and Ava repeated the question. Kevin laughed again. Rita and Ava both sounded and looked very concerned as they attempted to communicate with Kevin. After a moment, Tony smiled and let out a loud whistle, and Charlie began to bark. The barking grew loud and continuous until they heard Kevin undo his lock and open the door. Charlie stopped barking and paced throughout the kitchen, whining and wagging his tail. Kevin's face went from white and frightened to red with tears. Everyone entered and rubbed Charlie's back, and Kevin joined in. Charlie licked his face, and Kevin laughed. Everyone sat at the table to eat fruits and nuts and drink water. Rita and Ava explained that they were all going on a trip out of town. Kevin cheered in excitement, and Charlie howled. Everyone locked Kevin's door and headed to the truck parked on the street in front of the house. Tony sat in the driver's seat and Rita in the passenger. Kevin and Ava sat in the back with Charlie in between them. Tony started to pedal, and Rita played music on the sound system. Rita and Ava identified sights as they rode through town. When they reached the edge of town, they proceeded down a gravel road. There were rolling hills in all directions, with small patches of trees scattered sparsely throughout the hills. They turned onto another gravel road and traveled past more fields and small patches of trees. Tony slowed the truck down as the road led them into the forest. The treed path entered into a clearing which contained a large garden. Charlie began to whine and pace around the back seat as the truck came to a stop. Tony opened Kevin's door, and Charlie jumped out and ran into the trees. Kevin followed after Charlie, calling out his name. Kevin stopped at the edge of the trees as he could not see Charlie anymore. Everyone joined Kevin and walked deeper into the forest. They walked between large trees and eventually came to a clearing with 3 small houses. Charlie was running around the edge of the clearing, chasing another dog. The dogs ran up to them, and everyone rubbed their backs. Rita introduced Kevin to Wendy. Wendy looked very similar to Charlie, except she was not wearing a collar. Wendy and Charlie both licked Kevin's face. Everyone laughed, and the dogs ran off into the trees. They continued over to the houses, and Kevin noticed chickens walking around. He cheered in excitement and ran towards them. As he got closer, a man appeared in the doorway of one of the houses. He was hunched over, scratching the ground with his feet. His hands were tucked in his armpits, and his head was bobbing. Kevin stopped immediately, stood still, and watched the man with wide eyes. The man walked among the chickens, moving just like them. He walked a little closer to Kevin, flapping his arms and scratching the ground. Kevin turned around and ran back to the others, his face full of terror. Everyone laughed. As they approached the house, everyone walked right past the man, not acknowledging him or the chickens, and entered the house the man had come out of. Kevin kept staring at the man as he shielded himself behind everyone. The man never acknowledged any of them and went on scratching the ground. Inside the house were rows of chicken beds. Ava picked up one of the chickens and rubbed their back. Kevin did the same and laughed. Tony handed out empty cartons to everyone, and they walked through the rows filling the cartons with eggs. Rita and Ava explained to Kevin how chickens ate and used the toilet like they did, but also laid eggs. They went on to explain that sometimes eggs have small chickens in them, but that these eggs did not. Loud chirping sounds were coming from the roof of the house, and everyone but Kevin started to laugh. The sound of birds grew louder as they left the house, and when they were outside, they could see many birds chirping on the peak of the roof. The man was also on the roof, perched up next to them. Kevin's eyes were wide again, and he began to laugh. Tony wrote in his notebook. Everyone made their way through the crowd of chickens and over to the next house. Once inside, Rita introduced Kevin to Daisy, the cow laying in the bed of straw. As Tony started to rub Daisy's head and chin, her long tongue licked his arms, and Kevin laughed. Ava rubbed Daisy's back, and Rita invited Kevin over to her stomach. Rita grabbed Daisy's udders and started to fill her bucket with milk. Kevin's eyes were wide as he started to use another udder like Rita. Daisy moaned, Kevin jumped back, and everyone laughed. Rita poured some of the bucket into a glass container and passed it around for everyone to try. Everyone drank and made sounds of enjoyment. Rita and Ava explained how Daisy ate and used the toilet like they did, but also made milk. Kevin drank and nodded his head. Tony wrote in his notebook. There were chirping sounds coming from the roof of the house, and everyone started to laugh. Everyone turned to look out the door of the house and saw many birds flying away from the roof. Kevin went to the doorway of the house to watch the birds, and the man dropped down from the roof to the ground in front of him and ran to the edge of the clearing. Kevin turned around and laughed, and everyone laughed and nodded. Kevin circled around the houses, following the man as he ran around the edge of the clearing. Kevin could hear a sound coming from the other side of the clearing beyond the tree's edge. The sound grew louder, and out of the trees appeared a horse. The man ran past the horse, and the horse ran after him. Kevin followed them as they ran around the clearing. Then Charlie and Wendy appeared from the trees and ran after the man and the horse. The birds from the roof flew down and followed everyone as they all ran together. Kevin kept running around the houses, laughing and watching them chase each other around the clearing. The horse was running up behind the man and brought its head down close to the ground. The man jumped up and landed seated on the back of the horse. Kevin laughed, clapping and running, calling out to everyone in Daisy's house. The man had his arms stretched out in the air as he rode the horse, and the birds flew all around him. He then hopped up and stood on the back of the horse as it was running. Kevin continued to laugh and cheer. The man kept his arms outstretched and balanced on one foot as the horse continued to run around the clearing. Suddenly, he dropped back down to a seated position, and the horse turned off into the forest, and the dogs and birds followed. Kevin ran over to where they entered the forest and could not see them anymore. Everyone smiled at Kevin when he joined them back in Daisy's house. Trying to catch his breath, Kevin explained what had happened in the clearing, and everyone nodded and smiled. Kevin walked over and rubbed Daisy's chin like Tony was. Daisy licked his face, Kevin jumped back, and everyone laughed. Rita invited Kevin to use one of Daisy's udders again, and they finished filling the glass containers. Everyone said goodbye to Daisy and walked to the last house in the clearing. Inside there was a bed, dresser, stove, and a large table without monitors or a camera. The walls were covered in drawings of birds, chickens, cows, horses, dogs, fish, and flowers. Kevin admired the portraits and pointed out Charlie, Wendy, Daisy, and the horse. Everyone smiled and nodded and Tony wrote in his notebook. They made their way back around to the chicken house to find the man sitting on the ground with his eyes closed. All the chickens had stopped moving around and were sitting around him. Charlie and Wendy were also lying next to him and watched everyone walk by. They carried the eggs and milk back through the forest and loaded them in the truck. They grabbed containers from the back of the truck and made their way over to the garden. Charlie, Wendy, and the man followed them. Everyone picked fruits and vegetables from the garden and filled their containers. Charlie and Wendy chased each other in and around the garden. Birds swooped down and sat on the wires holding up the tomato plants. They chirped and sang, and then Tony whistled back to them as he picked through the garden. Kevin watched and laughed. The man started to laugh too, without making a sound. Kevin saw the man laughing and started laughing too. Everyone laughed as the man continued to rock quietly back and forth. Kevin looked at everyone and laughed as the man kept laughing. Kevin saw that the man's face was red and tears were falling down his cheeks. The man never stopped laughing, and neither did Kevin. Eventually, Kevin started to cry, as him and the man continued to laugh uncontrollably. Everyone laughed harder as Kevin and the man continued. Charlie and Wendy ran over and started howling and licking everyone's faces. The birds chirped and sang louder, flapping their wings and jumping around the wire. Soon everyone was on the ground, holding their stomachs, laughing and crying. As exhaustion set in, everyone started to calm down, and the man started to clap without making a sound. The dogs continued to howl and bark, and the birds continued to sing and dance. Everyone started to clap with the man, and the man began to throw his head back and howl like the dogs. At the edge of the clearing, the horse entered, ran full speed around the garden, and then turned back into the forest. The man clapped at the horse as it ran by and stopped clapping when it entered the forest again. He closed his eyes and sat silently, with a big smile on his face. Everyone did the same, and Kevin watched everyone. Everyone breathed in and out deeply and giggled once in a while. Kevin did the same. The dogs laid in the middle of everyone, and the birds sat silent. Tony wrote in his notebook. Charlie and Wendy got up, ran out of the garden, and back into the forest. The man got up and started to look for vegetables again, and everyone did the same. Rita and Ava explained to Kevin which fruits and vegetables were ready to be picked and which ones were not. When Kevin filled his container, everyone cheered. Tony gave an empty container to Kevin and took his full one to the truck. Everyone drank from their water bottles and ate some of their fruits and vegetables. When someone found a large fruit or vegetable, they would hold it up for everyone to admire. Once all their containers were loaded into the truck, Rita and Ava grabbed more containers, and everyone headed back into the forest. They walked into the man's house in the clearing, grabbed 2 buckets and a net, and walked deeper into the forest. They came upon another clearing that was full of flowers. They followed a path to a small house in the middle of the clearing, and Kevin heard buzzing sounds as they approached. Rita and the man took a container and walked next to the house full of bees. Kevin watched with wide eyes as the bees flew around Rita as she switched out her container with one that was already in the house. They continued around the house and down the path to the other side of the clearing. Kevin, Ava, and Tony walked around the edge of the clearing to the other side, picking flowers along the way. When everyone met up again, they tried some honey from the container and made sounds of enjoyment. Rita explained that the bees ate flowers and that honey was the flowers which the bees spit back up. Kevin's eyes grew wide and everyone laughed. They continued further into the forest and stopped at a tree with a pipe sticking out of it. Everyone tried some of the sap from the container hanging from the pipe and made sounds of enjoyment. They headed further into the forest and came to a stream that was flowing over large rocks. They watched as Ava and Tony balanced their way along a line of rocks with the buckets and a net staring into the water. They stopped, and Ava dipped the net into the water. Tony filled the buckets with water, and Ava pulled out 3 fish with the net. Kevin cheered, and everyone laughed. Tony placed the fish in one bucket, and they walked back over the rocks. The man walked past everyone, continuing back in the direction they came, and everyone followed. When they returned to the clearing with the small houses, the man walked up to the fire pit in front of his house, and Tony set the buckets on the ground. He took the bucket of water and emptied it into the pot that was positioned over the fire pit. He collected some wood and let Kevin start the fire. Ava and Rita sat on either sides of the man, Kevin and Charlie next to Ava, and Tony and Wendy next to Rita. Next to the fire pit was a small table with pans and utensils, and in between Kevin and Tony was a drum. The man got up and walked over to a few chickens sitting in front of their house. He circled around them several times before walking back to the fire. As he walked back, 3 chickens followed behind him. He sat back down next to the empty bucket and stared into the fire. Kevin giggled, and everyone smiled as they stared into the fire. The chickens walked around everyone, inspecting and keeping their distance from the fire. One of the chickens walked past Kevin and went closer to the fire. The 2 other chickens stayed behind everyone and then started to make their way back to their house. The remaining chicken walked around the fire, then over to the man and sat in his legs. The water in the pot started to boil, and the man started to cry. Kevin giggled again, but everyone frowned and sat silent, watching the fire. The man closed his eyes and continued to cry. Kevin started to frown, and Charlie and Wendy began to whine. Tony grabbed a stick and started to beat the drum. He grabbed another stick and handed it to Kevin. They beat the drum together as Ava grabbed the chicken from the man's lap and held it over the empty bucket, while Rita used a knife to cut its head off and collect the blood. Charlie licked Kevin's face as he watched and continued to beat the drum. Ava grabbed a large flat board and knife and placed them on the ground in front of her. She grabbed one of the fish and began to cut it into pieces. The man continued to cry as Ava placed the cut meat into the fish bucket. Ava cleaned off the board and handed it to Rita to place it on the ground in front of her. Tony and Kevin continued to beat the drum, and Kevin's eyes grew wide as Rita grabbed the chicken by the legs and held it in the bubbling water. She pulled the chicken out, laid it on the board, and started to pull out its feathers and place them in a container. Tony and Kevin stopped beating the drum. Tony removed the pot from the fire, and Kevin rubbed Charlie's back. Ava grabbed the pieces of meat from the fish bucket and placed them in a container. She set the rest of the fish meat on a pan over the fire. Rita finished plucking the chicken's feathers and proceeded to remove the insides of the chicken into the bucket of blood. She placed the chicken meat inside of the last container after removing both legs and giving one to each dog. Rita closed all the containers and Ava served the fish to everyone. The man stopped crying and was smiling at the fire. Everyone enjoyed the fish. Tony whistled and motioned to the sky, and everyone got up and walked in a new direction through the forest. They came to a clearing with a large hill of rocks and grass, and made their way up on a path that wrapped around it. When they reached the top, they were above the trees, and the man clapped silently as he sat and faced the sunset. Left of the sunset was all fields, and to the right was all trees. Everyone sat and watched the sunset, and the man laughed and cried. Tony looked over at everyone and back to the sunset and began to cry too. Kevin saw Tony, got up, and rubbed his back. Everyone except Kevin laughed and cried as they looked out at the sunset together. Tony nodded at Kevin, and Charlie licked Tony's face. Tony wrote in his notebook. As the sun began to disappear on the horizon, everyone made their way back. They arrived to find Daisy and the horse laying by the fire. Ava sat beside Daisy and rubbed her back. Rita sat by the horse and rubbed his back, and Kevin joined her. Tony started to beat the drum, louder than before, and the man started to dance around in time with the beat. Kevin laughed, and the dogs howled and jumped next to the man. The horse yelled, and Daisy moaned. Kevin started to dance like the man, and everyone laughed. Rita danced with Charlie, Ava danced with Wendy, and Tony kept beating the drum. Everyone laughed and cheered and danced under the night sky. Kevin pointed out the moon at the top of the trees and howled, and everyone joined in. As everyone danced around the fire, Tony reached into his pocket, threw his hand toward the fire, and made it explode with sound, light, and color. Kevin laughed and cheered. The horse and dogs ran off into the forest, and Daisy returned to her house. After a while, the man danced his way into the darkness of his house and disappeared. Tony put out the fire, and everyone returned to the truck. Kevin kept looking back to the door of the man's house as they walked away. Tony whistled loudly, and eventually Charlie joined them, jumping into the back seat and licking Kevin's face. Tony wrote in his notebook and then started to pedal. The headlights of the truck passed over the garden and out down the gravel road. Everyone was smiling and giggling and looking at everyone else. Everyone stayed silent the entire ride home and joined in rubbing Charlie's back.